Good afternoon and welcome to a special edition of Tactics Board. I thought this week we would mix it up as things look very different at Norwich City. Obviously, Dean Smith is no longer in charge of the football club. I did one while Alan Russell was in charge. It doesn't look like he'll be in charge of this game against Blackburn either. Obviously, Norwich yet to confirm David Wagner as their new head coach, but it looks like it is going to happen. And I thought we would break down what Wagner sort of has done at previous clubs and how that may look tactically at Norwich City, as your guess for an FA Cup predicted 11 is as good as mine. Given the new head coach element, I'm not sure he will have trained with them before he gets into the dugout, if he's in the dugout at all. And also the fact that it is a cup game means there's obviously the great possibility that Norwich do rest some players and try and mix things up a little bit. So looking forward to seeing how they go with that 11 and looking forward to watching that game. But I thought at this time, probably for regular viewers of Tactics Board, it would be more interesting to sort of delve into David Wagner's tactics and see what they might be subjected to in the Carrow Road stands. So we're going to mainly be looking at his Huddersfield team and how they used to sort of set up. But it's worth noting that most of these principles sort of came from before his time at Huddersfield when he was at Borussia Dortmund 2 and went on to be represented at Schalke and Young Boys, where he was after he left Yorkshire. A first prerequisite is something that I'm sure you'll hear plenty and probably already have over the last few days, that David Wagner worked under and was a good friend of Jurgen Klopp, who not only had a significant impact on his personal life, Wagner was the best man at Klopp's wedding, but also in his professional life, where Wagner took a number of the key principles that Klopp applied to his Borussia Dortmund first team and applied them to other teams, because Wagner's first managerial posting was to prepare players to play in that Borussia Dortmund first team. So all those ideals about gegenpressing and those sorts of things, it feels like every German manager that arrives in the Premier League or in England at all really is sort of compared to Klopp, and people try and find that tenuous link. That was a little bit the case with Daniel Farke, and people try to force the similarities, but with Wagner there really is no need, because the link certainly isn't tenuous on or off the pitch, and that's what you'll probably see. The first thing to say is that pressing was really important, and this was the team that Huddersfield deployed for their playoff final in 2017, obviously, which they won and ended up going into the Premier League from. And pressing was a really, really important aspect of the game for this side. Now, the usual sort of expected reaction once you lose the ball is to drop back and to react to that by going more defensive. But for coaches like Wagner and Klopp, and even Pep Guardiola, while who's at Bayern Munich and now at Manchester City, the idea when you lose the ball is to go forward. Now, that's not only to try and win the ball back in dangerous areas, but it means you can stop a counter-attack. So where losing the ball and dropping back, you might give a player 3 or 4 seconds to find the right pass to kick off a counter-attack. If you lose the ball and then go straight forward, that centre-back, that right-back, whoever's got the ball, to try and launch further forward players into that counter doesn't have the time to pick that pass and is under pressure immediately. So it's a defensive principle as much as an attacking one. I know that Klopp quote about how a good counter-pressing situation is as good as any number 10. I know that gets bandied about a lot, but it is also a defensive strategy and one that's quite effective if you can do it properly. So that's a principle of Wagner's team, and pressing is quite key as well. Now, I know Dean Smith spoke a lot about pressing, and that was something that didn't actually end up really materialising too much in front of our eyes, and it's something that I think all coaches want to say is part of their game because it's quite trendy at the moment. But Wagner actually is a disciple of pressing and somebody who really holds it as an important part of his team's tactical setup and their game. So I'm looking forward to seeing how he imparts that at Norwich. The only concern for me there would be Teemu Pukki is an intelligent presser, but at his age, he's 32 now. I'm not sure he has the athleticism to really go at it with the vigour and the athleticism that Wagner's Huddersfield team did at times, and that Wagner likes to try and do with his teams. So it's interesting to see how those Norwich players might fit around that. You'd like to think Josh Sargent, who's actually famed for his pressing and obviously would have perfected that in Germany as Wagner did, you'd like to think he'd be perfect for it. And perhaps that's another argument in a growing list of arguments as to perhaps why Sargent in the long term could be worth a go through the middle for Norwich. And then you look at the other players Norwich have, and you think perhaps it's not particularly geared to pressing. So it will be interesting to see how Wagner deals with that. We've spoken a lot, not only here, but on the preview show earlier today, on the Pinkham preview show, we discussed how, as much as he's a sort of tactics manager and he likes to impart his ideas on the team, the pressure is on him to deliver now, because Norwich's financial imperatives this year are such that there's enormous pressure on them to be promoted. So as much as he is quite a tactical idealist, he's probably have to become a little bit more pragmatic once he arrives, because Norwich don't have a lot of money to go into the transfer window and transform the squad, and they perhaps don't have the perfect squad to set up how Wagner likes to set up. But when I come on to some other tactics, I think you'll see how they're perhaps slightly more suited in other areas. But in the pressing department, you do wonder a little bit whether it's perfectly suited to Norwich, or if Wagner needs to change that setup a little bit. And I think Josh Sargent starting, perhaps even in a central role, could be a key component of that. But I'm going to now look at another key aspect of Wagner and his setup that I think actually will suit Norwich a little bit better, but there are still issues, and that's this. Hopefully you can see the diagram fairly well. When he was at Huddersfield, the two wingers cut in, and we're going to discuss this in a little bit as well, but not only did they cut in, but the rotation among that front four was so much that they were rarely actually proper wingers and out on the wing, and that created space out wide for Löw and Smith to go and attack those wings, much like Max Aarons and Jamal Lewis did in the early Daniel Farke years. Now, I think Norwich actually could be suited to this, because they've got players like Dimitris Giannoulis. Sam McCallum is quite an attacking fullback. Max Aarons, obviously, the same man is there. They have got the players that perhaps could do that if the setup was there and the requirements were there at fullback. They have, at least. But the problem for me is that they've now dispatched of most of their wingers. Christos Jolis, Milo Rashica, Przemysław Płacheta, all left on loan this summer, and Płacheta has now returned as a result of injury. So that doesn't feel like he's going to play a significant part there. And you do wonder where the space is going to be created if Norwich don't have those players who start off as wingers and go inside. And perhaps that's another argument for Jolis being recalled. I've seen plenty of that over social media, and it's no wonder that when Norwich don't really have the money to enter the transfer market, people are looking to try and cope with those issues elsewhere. Bali Mumba's played as a left winger that cuts inside for Plymouth in his loan there this season. That was actually where he played when I went to watch him at Burton a couple of months ago. And you feel like perhaps the players Norwich want for that system are in and around the club, but they're not really in form and they're not particularly available. So it'll be interesting to see if Wagner does want to deploy this sort of system, how he would cope with that at Norwich. But for me, it feels like the increased clamour for inverted wingers would probably go up another notch once Wagner arrives, because if he wants to deploy this system, which could work very well for the fullbacks he's going to have, he's probably going to need slightly different options on the wing, and that'll be an interesting one to follow. Another interesting aspect of his Huddersfield team is that the creativity and a lot of the passing comes from here. Now, a main difference between his side and Daniel Farke's side, and I think that on that last point, it was actually a similarity, but the main difference for me is the varied commitment to passing ideals. Now, Daniel Farke, obviously, as we all know, absolutely committed to short passing, possession play, keeping the ball. But under David Wagner, Huddersfield weren't particularly like that. Schindler, who I've got highlighted as centre-back, a big part of his game was his ability to play the ball forwards. And I think that could actually work in Ben Gibson's favour, a man who's obviously found himself in and out of the team in the last couple of years, struggled with form and fitness. But he's Norwich's best passer out of defence at the moment. For me, he's quite far ahead of Grant Hanley and Andrew Omobamidele, and I wonder if that will work in his favour now that Wagner has arrived. Schindler played that role very well for Huddersfield, but he wasn't always just playing short passes. He liked to play quite long passes and send the ball forwards towards Nahki Wells and to cut out some of those lines. So that's something that you perhaps can't expect to see from Wagner, unfortunately. I, for one, love watching short passing football, but that's not something that Wagner's consistently done, and he's like to trust a couple of players quite deep, usually a centre-back and a midfielder, as it was with Aaron Moy and Schindler at Huddersfield, and I think Norwich do have the players to do that a little bit. Probably Liam Gibbs can do that, perhaps not perfectly, perhaps not as well as somebody like Mario Vrancic might have been able to under Daniel Farke, but I think he can play that role. And then at centre back, as I said, Ben Gibson, which will be interesting because I think Gibson does perhaps compromise certain other abilities. Pressing relies on a high defensive backline if you want to do a high press, and I'm not sure he suits that given his struggles with athleticism. I think leaving a lot of space behind him could be a struggle. So there are elements of this Norwich squad, and that's what's coming out for me across this video, that could cope with certain elements of David Wagner's system, but there are contradictions in every one of those positions, and it's a squad that's sort of quite mixed match with what Wagner wants. And as a tactics-based manager, it'll be interesting to see how he copes with that once he arrives at Norwich. And one more thing I'll highlight, because I think it's quite interesting, is the interchangeability of those front four. And I spoke about it briefly earlier, but that's certainly something Wagner's setups have in common with Daniel Farke's, in that the striker and the wingers and the attacking midfielder quite often will rotate around each other. And Wells was a sort of focal point at Huddersfield under Wagner, but he certainly moved around. The wingers were barely wingers, and Brown would drift out wide and allow Kachunga and Van La Parra to come inside. And I think that's something that could suit Norwich well. They're looking for new ways of creativity because they're not really creating chances very clearly. You don't see Teemu Pukki slid in on goal very often, and that was something Gibson actually referenced in his post-match interview after the Watford game on Monday. And I think when they're looking for new forms of creativity, this is quite a simple way of creating space and finding ways to do that. And they have got intelligent movers in that side. They've got Teemu Pukki, Gabriel Sara, whose movement is fantastic and maybe has gone a little bit under the radar. They have got the players in and around those forward areas to be able to do that. I'd like to see a bit more of that from Josh Sargent and Adam Eder, maybe, if they're going to be regular fixtures. But yeah, I think Norwich are a team who have looked better when they've rotated a lot and when they've been a bit more free-flowing in their movement on the ball, and that's something Wagner's certainly going to bring, where Dean Smith's structure was perhaps a little bit more, well, structured is the word, really. His attack was a little bit more structured. I think Wagner will come in and probably allow Norwich. He won't think so much about the consequences as soon as you lose the ball, because the pressing that's what it's all about. It's not about sitting in your structure and getting back into your structure. It's about, if you're left wing and you need to press left wing, you just press left wing. It's not about everybody knowing their exact positions in their own half the whole time. So in a way, that commitment to pressing allows you to be a bit more free-flowing with your movement on the ball, because if you lose the ball, it's the same situation, whether you're a right winger at left wing or a left back in attacking midfield. Everybody knows that they just press the closest area and they intelligently stop the ball going to other areas. And I think that is something that will probably come into Wagner's thinking as he thinks about how to attack and defend with this Norwich side. That there is a number of elements really for David Wagner to consider as he arrives at Carrow Road. Tactically, it's been quite poor this season. Otherwise, a team of players or a squad of players this good would be achieving far more than they have in the Championship. So I think part of that is why Dean Smith has lost his job, and hopefully part of that is why David Wagner is going to come in and make such a big difference. I, for one, am looking forward to how those things change, and hopefully you are as well. I think if you're watching Tactics Board, you're probably quite interested to see how the setup of the team changes now that Wagner's taken over. It may well take time, but it's something that's going to be interesting to watch and something that's worth observing. So thank you for joining me on Tactics Board. If you want more David Wagner content, we're certainly not short. There's plenty on Pinkham.com, the Pinkham Plus app, Pinkham YouTube channel, our social media channels as well. So you're certainly not going to run out if you're looking for your David Wagner fix over this weekend. Hopefully it's an FA Cup win for Norwich City, but I think probably our major concern is the performance and what it means for David Wagner's tenure and Norwich's promotion hopes in the long run. So looking forward to seeing how that plays out. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you again on Tactics Board soon.